evening, everyone. My name is Catherine Carney-Feldman. I'm on the Ipswich Conservation Commission, and I want to welcome you all from the Ipswich Conservation Commission for our speakers series. Tonight we have Gretel Clark, and she is going to be talking about the role of the honeybee as pollinator. Gretel grew up on a farm in eastern Connecticut and has spent over 35 years with bees, with honeybees. She even, about 20 years ago, spent some time in Kenya in a small forested village, and she taught farmers who were subsistence farmers how to manage bees. At the height of her bee management, she was tending 43 colonies of bees that were spread throughout Ipswich, Essex, and Hamilton. And right now she is managing about 10 colonies of bees, all on her property in Hamilton. She has 30 acres. And I'm sure she's going to give us a wonderful talk today. She'll be talking about many of the environmental issues that are affecting honeybees. A lot of us know what they are. We know that how pesticides affect them. But she'll also be talking about weather condition, loss of habitat, and many other things, including the role in the life cycle of the honeybee. And with that, I'd like to present Gretel Clark.
Wonderful job. I don't think I could have done it better. So, welcome. As I've said to Catherine, beekeepers always love to talk about bees. So I'm doing what I love to do and sharing whatever I might happen to know that you might like to know about. So please interrupt me whenever you want, but I will start out with what I know is probably the first question that's on many of your minds, which is, what is colony collapse disorder and what's caused it? And I think it's a good starting point, especially to a conservation commission that is concerned about what goes out into the atmosphere as people are farming or gardening or attending to their own property. And clearly, this issue, which has produced the loss of thousands of colonies, I think the most dramatic losses are those beekeepers that we call industrialized beekeepers, those that go across the country with 18-wheelers dragging thousands of colonies. And they plunk them down in holding yards. Now picture this. Let's say they're going for the almond pollination. And I was just reading there something like, it's hard to believe. I believe the figure I read was 800,000 acres of almond trees. And we are using about a third to a half of all of the managed honeybee colonies to allow the almond farmers to produce this product. And so these commercialized beekeepers take their 18-wheelers, many of them, and they will have a contract with an almond tree farmer. They have to produce, when they arrive, bees that have so many frames of bees alive in their boxes, and they'll plunk them down. But before they do that, they have to wait until the trees are really ready to be pollinated. So they get put in what are called holding yards. These holding yards are often in the Central Valley of California. Usually they're giant deserts that have nothing of any particular food value growing. So what does the beekeeper do? He feeds them. He feeds them essentially high fructose corn syrup. And you and I know how nutritious corn syrup is. Well, it's about as useful for bees too. So that is the cheap way to get what otherwise would be sugar water, which is what we feed our bees when they run out of nectar. And they may even have some pollen patties that they can throw in. But after however many weeks that they're sitting in this place with this disastrous diet, where do they get put? They get put in a desert of almond trees. I call it a desert because it's the only thing that's growing there. There is, and we can apply this to cornfields, to soybean fields, to the what we call industrialized form of farming now that has taken over our country since the end of the last World War. And those farms are virtual nutrient deserts. It would be the same for you if all you did was eat almonds or oranges or corn and that was your only diet. You wouldn't last very long. So the bees come away from their few weeks there severely compromised in just physically how they have been fed, what they've had to forage on. Now there is something else, of course, that's come along, and that's the Varroa mite. And you've probably heard about the Varroa. It looks like a little black flat. I'm trying to think. Tick. Varroa, Varroa, and it arrived around 1983, and I'll never forget it because that year, that spring, I found that I had no bees. All of my colonies had died. I'm not even sure where they came to us from, but this is one of the joys of globalization, right? They arrived from another continent, and since then, beekeepers have been trying to handle the Varroa. The Varroa lay their eggs in the small cells of the honeycomb along with the pupa. And the progeny, as they are growing before they're actually born and mate inside this cell where there's a pupa growing. And of course, it's swimming in this wonderful, nutritious food that they're fed. But and then they multiply over time. And if you don't get them early in the spring, it's by geometric progression. They develop to the point where they will destroy your colony. So beekeepers started treating the Varroa. And what did they use? Chemicals. And they found that after 5-6 years, that the chemicals they were using, the Varroa would be becoming resistant to. So we had new chemicals developed. Of course, Bayer and Monsanto and whoever else produces these chemicals are making out like bandits. And it was pretty clear that unless we changed the chemicals that we use, but over time it became fairly clear to us that we were also killing our bees with these chemicals. The chemicals were building up in the comb, and it was just a long-term disaster. So beekeepers have really returned to trying to do things naturally, interrupting the brood cycle so that there aren't cells with pupa in that the Varroa can lay and reproduce, for example. That's one way of doing it. There are other methods. We now use screen bottom boards underneath our colonies so that the Varroa, when it falls off of a bee, it doesn't just fall to the floor and climb back up. It falls through to the ground, and so forth and so on. So people are trying to do that kind of thing. But going back to the colony collapse disorder, we've talked about the monocultures that are really deserts, the pests and sicknesses that bees are now more prone to because they're weakened by the Varroa. And we're also finding that there's loss of habitat, that where bees used to live, they no longer can thrive because it's been turned into a flowerless landscape in many places. Certainly either it's paved over, or it's just, again, going back to these monocultures, that there's nothing there but that one kind of thing. I was pleased to see that in the recent Farm Bill, money has gone to inducing farmers to put in hedgerows, to diversify their fields, because we know that if a farmer is growing 4 or 5 different kinds of products within a certain area, and honeybees will fly up to 5 miles to find their food, then they'd get a variety of sources for what they want to eat. And the Farm Bill did allocate some funds to try and encourage farmers to break up these giant mile upon mile of only one crop and to put in islands of other diverse kinds of plants. And also, instead of using chemicals to uh, turn their fields over, to grow clover and alfalfa, which is what we always used to do. That was, of course, the original way in which farmers kept their fields going. But at any rate, there is, I would say in a nutshell, what the real problem is with colony collapse disorder. I guess finally, going back to the industrialized beekeepers, think of yourself if you were being moved from one time zone to another, from one climate zone to another. And you were in a small environment where the equipment that you're in is banging around for a week while you're traveling across or up or down this continent. The bees themselves have not done well under those kinds of circumstances.
Can they measure stress in the bees from that type of situation? Because I would imagine it would be very stressful.
Yes.
Wouldn't that affect their productivity even inside a comb, a fertile comb box?
Well, I think they'd probably measure it in terms of the length of the bee's life.
Great.
So,
Can you repeat the question?
oh yes, the question was, can they measure the stress of the bees that are undergoing this kind of experience? And I think we're more likely to be able to tell from how well a colony itself does. So, but I'm going to go back now to a bee colony. Do any of you know about bee culture and the various kinds of, how deep your knowledge is? Maybe I should start out with what questions you might have.
Collapse disorder. Are your hives suffering that?
Yeah, the question is, are my hives suffering from CCD or colony collapse disorder? Not in the same way, unless I had the similar kind of situation where the high school put nothing but, let's say, 7 on their fields, and it drifted over into my property. So I suffer much more from the effect of Varroa mites and the various kinds of illnesses that bees can get, like nosema. Nosema is a form of dysentery, and it comes very often. Bee colonies die of that in the winter. I have one that's already died of it. But again, they're more prone to be susceptible to it if the Varroa have weakened them. So you've lost your hives to foul brood, perhaps. Yes. Yes, generally. In fact, the theory is, especially with one of the big-time beekeepers who was absolutely stunned when he came and he found umpteen colonies with no bees, and it's been traced to either clothianidin or imidacloprid, which is they lace the seeds with this, and the plant grows, and it produces a pollen. Its leaves have within it this poison, and the insect, when it collects its nectar or pollen or chews on the leaf, dies. It's designed to kill the insect. And in many cases, some of the theory was that some of these bees, if they didn't die, it screwed up their brain to the effect that they couldn't find their way home. That they flew out and they harvested this, but then they couldn't find their way back home. Who's working? Someone's working on bee replacement.
Probably is, aren't they?
What?
I don't know, like wrapped up seeds, fertilizer.
Well, I don't even get me going on Monsanto. That yes. Well, the question is there a substitute for the honeybee? And the interesting thing is, of the, how many were you saying, Catherine, were native? 4,000 different kinds, native honeybees, or bees, native bees.
Native bees, not honeybees, 4,000.
Native bees.
In 4,000 native bees in North America.
4,000 native bees.
Separate than honeybees.
Right. So as you know, honeybees are an import from most of the honeybees in this country are Italian bees, but there are many other races. There's some from Russia, some from the Caucasus. Some of them are hybrids of the bees that we have already. Honeybees are fairly unique as a phenomenon because they're social. They live in large communities, and most bees do not. There are a few who have maybe much smaller congregations, but nothing like the 60,000 that is typical of a midsummer colony. So,
Can you explain to the audience where honeybees come from? Because I think they're with native bees as opposed to
yes, well,
the question.
it's just they were brought probably in the 1640s or 30s over with the colonists when they came. I'm not sure if how they would have survived that trip across the ocean, but there were no honeybees here on this colony on this continent when the early settlers arrived, and eventually they were brought here. And there, even though there is the Starline and the Midnight and the Buckfast, which is from England, and the Russian and now the Minnesota Hygienic and so forth, they are all still honeybees with the same physical makeup of 6 legs, five eyes. They have 3 eyes across the top and 2 simple eyes and 2 compound eyes. And they process the nectar and pollen the same way. They collect an older bee. You may know that you have to be about 3 weeks old as a bee if you are going to go out and collect nectar and pollen. And let's say you're on your trip to pick up some nectar. Your sister came back to the hive and told you, hey, there's this great source of nectar down the road and around the corner and behind this house. And it's fairly complex, the directions they give to each other. And the bees that attend her dance will go and check it out. And if they like it, they come back and tell their sisters. And eventually, many from that colony will go to that place if they know, for example, loosestrife. If loosestrife is in bloom and they discover it down in the marsh, they will all go rushing down there. And I will find when I harvest a super, which is one shallow box full of surplus honey, it will be all honey from the same source. And they will bring that honey back. Interestingly enough, that field bee will pass the honey to her sister, who is a 1 to 3 week old bee she isn't yet ready to go out and fly around in the environment. And she receives the honey on her tongue, and often she'll go off to a corner of somewhere aside from the busy colony and start the evaporating process. When the nectar comes into the colony, it's 50% water. And the bees are going to have to distill it down to 16.5 to 18.5% water. So imagine, it's sort of like cider right now, where we have to take 40 gallons to make 1 gallon of sap to make 1 gallon of syrup, maple syrup. Well, the same with pollen. Nectar. When the bees come in with nectar, they've got to distill it down to they've got to fan off all of that water to make it so that it will turn into honey. It won't become honey until it's lost all that water content. The same with pollen. When the bees come in, you've probably seen the pollen that they carry on their legs, right? They have combs on the front of their leg, or on the back of their leg, and on the front of their leg, these are the hind legs, they will have little pouches, and they'll be get covered with pollen, and they'll take these combs and scrape the pollen off their hair and pack it down into these little pouches that are at the back, that are on their hind legs. And then they fly home, and it's fun to watch them when they're really loaded up, because they fly, instead of like this, they fly like this because the weight is back here with all the pollen. That pollen doesn't get passed to a house bee. That pollen, actually the field bee comes in and puts it into a cell herself. And then the younger bees will come along and pack the pollen down so that when more pollen comes in, it can be added to the amount. So, but let's go back to the original life cycle of the honeybee. Are you aware of what makes a queen and what makes workers and what makes a drone? Well, you know, a drone, I have a picture here of a drone. I usually use my thumb as an example. They're fat and they have pretty much a square bottom, and a worker is roughly one length of my finger, and a queen is nice and long and svelte, and she has a pointed back. Very often she's a single color rather than striped. So those are the differences in the colony in terms of the three different kinds of bee. But as you probably know, there's only one queen, and during the middle of the summer, there can be up to 50, 60,000 workers, or maybe a small percentage of those will be drones. And of course, the drone's function is to be there to inseminate another virgin queen if she should emerge. But yes, we have a question?
So that is just the function of the drone? The drone doesn't leave the hive and go hunt and come back? The drone's just stuck?
In case, okay, I'll repeat the question. Is that just the function of the drone? Doesn't he do anything else?
Right.
Basically, no. If you really want to know, the drones lead the life of Riley. They get fed when they're first born. The first few days, they beg for the food from the nurse bees, who are also 1 to 3 days old. And after that, they may go find their own food, but it's food that's been brought into the colony by the field bees, or the worker bees have placed it. And they essentially, what a drone does is, once he's a day or so old, yes, he can go out and take a flight, and he's going to look for his buddies who are hanging out in what we call congregation yards or drone yards. And what do you think they do? They hang out there. Yeah, I don't know if they have nectar there to drink, but their purpose, of course, is to cavort with each other until maybe a virgin queen comes flying by. And if they see a virgin queen come by, they all chase her. And they, of course, they are going to perform the function they were born to do, which is to inseminate the queen. And the queen will mate with enough drones, maybe a half a dozen, maybe a dozen, maybe 15. Maybe she's tired and she flies back to the colony and she doesn't have quite enough sperm in her spermatheca. She'll go out a second day. And the drones that are left, because you're aware, of course, that by inseminating the queen, the drone commits suicide.
Oh, really?
All right? He actually, in the process of inseminating her, his member, which stays with her body, rips out his guts, and that's the end of life. Can you imagine the ecstasy? It just dies. So there you are. That's the life.
So then how do more drones come into the colony?
Well, how do more drones come into the colony? The drones are there because the queen decided to lay a drone egg. All right? So the queen, can you imagine being a mom and saying, let's see, I think this time I'm going to have a boy, or this time it's going to be a girl. So she decides. And when she lays that egg, in fact, the egg, and I'm going to get you some comb to let you see what a drone cell looks like.
So Gretel, that is a choice of the queen, not a function of the nurturing of the egg?
Actually,
Neither of you are on the mic right now.
yeah. was your question, Dave?
It's a function of the queen to decide what kind of egg to lay rather than the nurturing of the egg that creates the drone?
Well, there are two parts to this answer. One is the drone is laid by the queen because she chooses to lay a haploid egg. That's a drone that becomes a drone. All right, it's actually physiologically different from the diploid egg, which are all the workers or the queen. All right, if you're going to be female, you get laid as a diploid egg, but the drone is only a haploid egg. But you know, the bees also have, the colony has a little something to do with this. If they're getting crowded and they think they'd like to split and swarm and leave, and half of them leave when they do this, they're going to make a whole bunch of drone cells. And you'll notice on this frame, there, do you see these cells are much larger? See if I have, yes, here's even more. Can you see the difference? Look, here's flat here, and these are so big they're bulging out. So the queen knows when she's standing over these cells, well, this is where my little boys go. All right? Now, if she's laying, of course, all her diploid eggs up here, what is it? There's something else that determines the difference between the workers, the drone, and the queen. And that is when all these eggs are laid, and the queen will be laying pretty much in a circular pattern. I'll show you another frame. So here's one. Can you see? This one is a very clear nursery. That's where all the eggs were. Around the outside was the nectar and pollen. Okay? Can you see this, Dave? And on the other side, too. There are about 9,000 cells on this one frame. And the queen, incidentally, is laying anywhere from 1,500 to 2,000 eggs every day. All right? We're talking about May, June, July, August. September, she starts to slow down a bit. But during the productive season, she's laying like mad because those workers only last for 6 weeks. So she's got to constantly be replacing them, especially if you've got a community of about 50, 60,000. So here we have all these wonderful eggs that are in the nursery. And let's say I come along and I pull out a frame, and you can see this box. Just want you to see. So it looks like that. There are 10 frames in a box. And now, what's the point I was going to make? I've come and I'm working with my bees. And as a beekeeper, of course, I will have my hive tool. Maybe I'll just carry this with me. Without this, you're not a beekeeper. The reason is bees collect what we call propolis. And they use it to glue everything together in the beehive. All right? These frames will all be glued to each other. And, in fact, yes, I'll show you, we have an inner cover. Which is this. And the reason for the inner cover is we put this on in the summertime like this, over the top, and I take my hive tool, I slide it under and I crank it up and it goes pop, and all the glue that they've put on to hold this together comes apart. The reason we use it is if we didn't do that, they would be gluing all their frames below to the top, and I'd never get the top off. Okay? So this is sort of a self-defense kind of, in the wintertime, they're not building comb. You can see this is what we call burr comb. and I put it on like that, they can move around inside and they're not going to build any more excess comb. But if I leave it like that in the summer, they will build comb and connect those frames all to this box, and there's no tomorrow working with them. Okay, now back to me opening it up and pulling out a frame. Let's say I pull out that frame and I roll the queen and I accidentally kill her. What are they going to do? They now don't have a queen. They're going to take one of those cells that has a 1 to 3 day old egg. All right, it cannot be 4 days old. It has to be either 1, 2, or 3 days old. And they're going to, when it becomes 4 days old, these cells have all been being fed for the first 3 days, nothing but royal jelly, all right? But on the 4th day, if you're destined to become a worker, which is most of the bees in the colony, or a drone, you will be fed until day 9, when you get sealed over and you start to pupate. Right now, from day 4 to 9, you're a larva. You turn from an egg into a little worm. You'll get fed honey and pollen. You'll get fed nectar and pollen, all right? It's called bee bread, and that's the stuff that the house bee has packed down in, and she's also added some honey or nectar to that pollen, and she's going to now, all the bees that are about 5 to 7 days old are going to be feeding these bees when they're age 4 to 9 this bee bread. But the one that they decide they're going to turn into their replacement queen, or the 2 or 3 or maybe 7 or 10, they are going to feed them nothing but royal jelly. So what makes you a queen? The fact that you are fed royal jelly for the full 9 days until you're sealed over. Which I guess explains to me why a lot of people buy royal jelly, thinking that maybe they're going to live forever. I don't think that anyone's proved that that's going to happen. Yes?
Well, I thought there could only be one queen, though, in a colony.
Yes, so what happens? They've created maybe a half a dozen. These are called supersedure cells. And Dave, you should come over here so you can see my pictures. Okay. Can you see this little thing down here that looks like a peanut? That is a supersedure cell. All right, this is a queen. They've fed her and she becomes so huge that she spills out over the surface of the comb. So I could pull the comb out there and I might see several of these peanut-like cells hanging down parallel to the comb. And it only takes her 16 days, and then she and her fellow virgins are going to emerge in 16 days. This is an interesting little illustration. This is the queen, 16 days. A worker, it takes 21 days before it actually emerges as a full-blown worker. And a drone takes him 24 days, which is what the Varroa mite loves, because if they get into a drone cell, they can not only reproduce, they can mate and reproduce again. They can double the number of Varroa that they create. So when I see a frame full of Varroa comb, I probably won't put that back into my colony. I don't mean Varroa, I mean drone comb. I don't want a lot of drone, because it means I'm going to have a lot of Varroa mites. Okay? But your question was, what happens if they create 6 or 8 queens? So let's say you want, let's say you're the first one to hatch out, and you want to reign over this colony. What are you going to do?
Kill the rest.
Exactly, kill the rest. In case you didn't hear that. So what does she do? She comes out and she walks around and she very methodically rips off the end of the little peanut shell, and she puts her stinger in and she stings. The interesting thing is a queen can sting and sting again, all right? She can sting more than once. As you know, honeybees can only sting once, and they die just the way the drone dies inseminating the queen. A bee dies stinging you.
Queen stinger, not barb.
the queen stinger is not barbed. So it doesn't, this is why, of course, the workers die. It's barbed, and when they pull away from you, it pulls a little part of their, evidently a crucial part of their innards out. And attached to that part is a little sac. And that little sac has its own little muscle that continues to pump the venom into you for about 45 seconds. I don't know if you've ever been stung and you're curious to see what happens and you want to watch that barb. You can see it. You can just take a look. Don't pull it out right away. Just take a look, and you'll see it pumping away, administering that poison right up to the nth degree. Okay? However, you just want to watch. Well, I'll tell you, I watch it. I have watched it in detail because the venom has its own healing power. And it's absolutely astounding. Now, if you get stung and you don't want that venom, you're not going to grab it with your finger, because you're just going to be squeezing out that little purse that has all the poison in it, right? You'll just be administering it faster. It won't have to wait for the little muscle to do it. So what you're going to do is just scrape your finger sideways, all right? That way you get it out without administering the rest of the venom. But if you want the venom, don't touch it. Just leave it. Let it continue to pump it in. And of course, this is what we beekeepers do if we have arthritis coming on, if we have tennis elbow, if we have, well, of course, the most extreme case is multiple sclerosis. But in fact, bee sting therapy has been very successful. And I can vouch for the fact that I now have to get up at least 1 or 2 days a week and go out and collect bees in a bottle to give to a patient who goes to my son, who is an acupuncturist. And he not only does bee sting therapy, but he does it on the meridians so that he gets double benefit. It's terrific. If you know a beekeeper, be sure to stay friends with her if you start having trouble with things like arthritis, because bee stingers or beekeepers shouldn't ever have arthritis, for example. I mean, it's just one case. But let's see. Have we covered the gestation? I think so, of the bee. I think the other really interesting thing about honeybees is the fact that what they do is determined by how old they are. So when you're first born, you certainly can't go out and forage. You don't do that until you're about 3 weeks old. And the interesting thing is, in fact, this huge colony may have a queen presiding over it, but she's taken care of by maybe a dozen of the worker bees who feed her, who take away her feces, who fan her, who do whatever it is, clean her, and yet she's really at their mercy too, because if they decide that she's not laying up to snuff, let's say she's only laying 1,000 eggs a day, they might just decide we're going to replace her. Pardon? A coup. So you open your hive, and there you discover there are a whole bunch of super seed cells being developed. There's still a queen there, and you know those bees are replacing their own queen. They really, it is a colony intelligence that knows all of this. It's absolutely astounding how. But the colony does. And we'll talk for a minute about swarming, because that's another example of bees functioning as a social entity. Let's see. Oh, so there we are, a colony that really doesn't have a single ruler. But what determines all of the work that gets done is really how old you are and what sex you are. I guess we have really extreme sex role stereotyping, but there aren't too many men around to assign you. Nonetheless, you get assigned, or you are naturally a nursery. You take care of the larva, and you're in the nursery for your first 3 days. And then when you're the next couple of days old, you may be cleaning, you may be ventilating, you may be moving honey or nectar or pollen and placing it closer to where the brood is. It's interesting, they move their stores all around. In the fall, when I have a super, which is half the depth of this nursery box, the super is where they lay their surplus honey. The nice thing about honeybees is they don't mess their nursery with all their supplies. They put the supplies apart in a separate place, which is why we're able to come along and harvest it without destroying the nest. In other words, the eggs. We want those eggs are precious. And that's one reason why I brought for you to see a queen excluder. So this gets put on top of the hive. This is a nursery box, and it will be put like this, and there will also be another nursery box below it. By the time the bees are up to speed, they have roughly 20 frames, 10 in each box, and they will have probably anywhere from 6 to 7 of the frames in each box full of brood, and the other frames are going to have nectar and pollen and sealed honey. And when they're approaching that point, I will put a small box on top with 10 frames. They're half the depth of these frames, and that's where all the surplus honey goes. So, of course, the pollen is there as it comes in. It's their protein. So, and all of the amino acids and so forth. But the nectar is what becomes the honey. And it has traveled from the field to the colony in the honey stomach of that field bee. And there are evidently enzymes in the bee's honey stomach that lead to the conversion of the pollen into honey. But it doesn't become honey until, remember I mentioned it's roughly 50% water when it comes in, until it's been distilled down to 16.5% water. And it has a different flavor. It's really astounding when you think of it. And we don't really totally know what the magic thing is that makes what was nectar out here in the field having come to the colony in the stomach of a bee. And then being distilled, it becomes honey. So all of the surplus honey will go on top. And I use this queen excluder because the queen is bigger than the workers, as you can see from this picture. So she cannot get through this grid. As you can see, they're really fairly narrow, and only the workers get through here. So everything that goes in that box above the nursery is going to be devoid of eggs. And because there are no eggs there, there'll be no pollen, because the pollen is the feed for the brood. Okay? So that's how that works. Let's see, what other aspects of beekeeping have we not talked about? In the wild.
How does that work? Nobody's putting a queen excluder.
Oh, of course. And you know, I was showing you a picture of the bee tree from the Pulsifers property that I acquired thanks to John and the DPW department in Ipswich. That those bees had built their own comb inside the hollow spot of the tree. It was a dying tree, which is why they were cutting it down. And they will have their nursery in one place, and they'll have their honey at the far ends of it. Okay? So in the wild, they keep the honey just the same way. It's apart from the nursery. And And well, she's not likely to lay eggs where there's solid honey, and I'll show you what solid honey looks like. This was very fortunate. I went out this afternoon thinking I'd like to have something to show you that looks like this. This was a colony that died, and it had moved from the bottom box to the top box, and it moved away from the honey in this winter. Yes. So you can see, what I should do is let you see what and here incidentally is a brand new, even though it's in an old frame. This is what wax foundation looks like. It's just a sheet, and it has the shape of the hexagon that the bees draw out, and that's what it's just their suggestion to them, and they will draw that out and then start storing either honey, or the queen will be laying eggs in the empty cells and so forth. But I just want you to feel the difference. That's what it looks like. Now, hold on the outside, otherwise you'll make a hole in the, you see how heavy that is? This is pure honey. Yep. So, here, I have another. So here's just a purely empty one. That one had larvae in it, and it was used, but now it's been abandoned. They've eaten all the supply, but that's what I will have 10 of those in each colony box. Yes.
Now, the person who has turned me on to beekeeping, he's been doing it for 25 years, and he's not, he's self-taught. And as he was helping us set up our hive, he came with the 10 slats, and he prefers and had suggested we take one out because he creates extra room in the nursery for the queen, and he has these bumpers that he uses so that the spaces are not as tight for 10 and gives the queen just a little bit more room between some. Have you had experience doing that?
Well, what you're talking about is something that's basic to, in fact, beekeeping. Bees have what we call a bee space, and it's 5/8 of an inch. That's all they need. And if you give them more, they will fill it with burr comb or whatever. But you never ever, if you look at the way in which this is designed, the box and all of the parts that go on top of it or into it are respecting this knowledge that if you leave more than 5/8 of an inch, you get something like this. Do you see, this is burr comb, and it can become really messy. It can get to be much deeper than that. That's just the beginning of comb that they're making. So I use 9 frames for my supers because I want them to draw them out more, as you were saying, because then I get more honey per square inch. But in the nursery, I want 10 because I want to maximize the space, the number of cells for the queen to lay in. Only 9, and you're taking away a large chunk that she could have otherwise been laying in. And they don't need that space in the nursery. Okay, it's just in the supers above the nursery that you're concerned about that. There's so many mistakes that one can make when you're first starting out beekeeping, and you realize, I remember one time I put the hive box gets put on a stand, and there's a right side and a wrong side, and if you put it on the wrong side, you get just tons of burr comb. They'll just fill it up with excess comb. So you've got to know how everything fits, and every piece has to go very precisely.
Have you any
question is, I had experience with the plastic hives. The only experience I've ever had is when somebody gives me a box or a nuke and it has a plastic frame, and I know from experience the bees do not, first of all, I don't like plastic because it's not natural. Secondly, the bees don't like plastic, and they will do everything to avoid the comb when they're given a plastic comb. There are all kinds of tricks that beekeepers can use to entice them to build out comb on a plastic foundation, but and no, I don't. I use, but other people do. Yes, I guess so. It's just, I guess I was brought up on wood, and I prefer working with wood. But, yes. Another question?
How much, I'm reading, and here, I'm reading one thing about how much heat and sun the hive can handle optimally before the bees start overheating and overworking, and it becomes more difficult for them. And doppling of shade. So when I'm positioning a hive, how much real direct sun exposure am I supposed to be allowing?
How much sun is important in case that it didn't all get picked up. And it's a good question. The hive, the bees are going to be working to ventilate that hive and keep it at no higher, well, hopefully no higher than 100 degrees. I'm not sure if you're aware that in the wintertime, bees, although they are there in the colony, they are going to be keeping their colony at somewhere around 90 degrees, no matter what the temperature is outside. That's through kinetic energy. And they need the heat to build the comb, for example. They've got to have the heat. But they don't, if it gets too hot, then it melts the wax and then they've lost their house. So, and the larvae will be damaged. So they've also spent a certain amount of time ventilating. And the interesting thing is a box sits on another box that has a little rim like this. And they come in through the opening that's left by this rim. So there is this opening of that size at the bottom, and the bees will position themselves such that they fan, and they will fan bringing the air in from the bottom. And if you put your hand across the top, underneath the top, the cover, the top cover, you can feel that warm, wet air coming out. They set up a convection curve. And their purpose is to keep the colony at a very specific temperature, and also, of course, to fan off the moisture from the nectar so it will turn into honey. So, you know, fanning is done for a whole variety of purposes. They also do it to show if they have swarmed and they've found a place, the way for the others to come to inhabit. I wish we had time to talk about swarming, but that's an astounding example of bees deciding at one point that half of them are going to leave the colony because they're usually getting too crowded. Again, the reason for why you would want to have 10 frames and not 9. And the old queen leaves with half, 15, 20, 30,000 of the bees that were in that original colony. And they fly out and they sit on a branch. And you've probably seen this. That's what they're doing, is they're waiting while their scout bees go out and look for a place for them to set up housekeeping that's elsewhere. So they can, this is how bees reproduce themselves. They don't live as a single entity. They are a community. And so the community has to split itself to become a second, to reproduce itself, let's put it that way. So the old queen leaves, and meanwhile, of course, the young bees in the nursery box have created on the bottom of the frame, down here, what we call swarm cells. And if I'm inspecting them and I'm worried about swarming, I will just go out and tip up the box. I won't even pull out a frame. I'll just tip it up and see if there are swarm cells that they're beginning to build. And it will tell me that they're getting crowded. and the swarm impulse is already set in. So when they leave, they're leaving fully formed virgin queens who will hatch out a day or so later while they're looking for somewhere else to live. And how they decide where they're going to live is another absolutely unbelievable drama. But they have scout bees, maybe 100 of them, who are going out, maybe 50. And they're going to be looking for a place that is dark and inside somewhere, and there are fairly specific dimensions. Tom Seeley, who's done research on this, describes the typical place that they go. I put what look like giant flower pots out in the trees during swarm season, which is roughly mid-May to mid-June. That's when your bees are likely to swarm. And it has a hole in the bottom. And if a bee, one of them finds this place, which I'm sure to take at least a quarter of a mile away, I'll put it out in the woods or down, in a different part of the property, they will come back and report to their sisters. And they'll do a dance on the surface of the early swarm, describing this place that's just fantastic. It's just down the road and around the corner and over the trees. And so other bees will go out and check out this spot. And if they like it, they'll come back and tell their sisters. And eventually, the number of bees that are reporting on the number of places gets down to maybe 2 or 3. This is literally the forming of consensus. And at a certain point, they will all take off at the same time and move to that place that they've all decided they're going to go to. It's pretty astounding. We as humans have a lot to learn from, it's 8 o'clock, and I don't know if we have to end right now.
What happens in the winter when they start? How come we can't talk about the swarm thing now?
All right, so do we have to stop instantly at 8 o'clock? There, you wanted to know about a question?
Tell the story, what happens in the winter when they run out of food.
Oh, okay. What happens in the winter when they run out of food? They starve. Well, of course. I forgot to add, just as long as we have the men sitting on this side of the room. We will report to you that the drones, as fall is approaching winter, and it's really fun to go out and sit and watch what's happening, and you can see them dragging the drones out and dumping them, or basically telling them, sayonara, you are a mouth we do not want to feed. You are of no use to us through the winter because you have no function to keep us going. And so they are literally kicked out. And I can find the dead drones around on the outside of the colony. Well, I discovered that she wants to have her spermatheca full. She can live for 3 years. Think of that, when the workers only live for 6 weeks. The reason they only live for 6 weeks, incidentally, is their wings wear out. But the queen does no flying, right? She never leaves the colony except to head up a swarm. So I've lost myself in mid-sentence. You were... Yes. So she lives for 3 years because she doesn't fly, and I know. She may go out a second day when she's doing her nuptial flights. She may take 2 or 3 days to come back. She wants to know that her spermatheca is full. And a lot of diversity, as we've discovered, is really important. The more the variety of drones, the better.
But if she lives 6 years and she only does that once in 6 years, the guys are pretty useless.
They are not needed during the winter time, and of course she will start laying drones again the following spring, but they are not kept there through the winter. Yes.
I'd like to get back for a moment to colony collapse disorder.
Yes.
Better understand level of risk. Heard a lot in the media about it over the last. On the other hand, Massachusetts and Maine use commercialized bees on the cranberry, the blueberry, and the potato crop, and over the last 3 years,
it's bad enough that the beekeepers who are trying to make a living, last year they had to replace 30% of their colonies. Can you imagine if 30% of your inventory was wiped out? This year, they're calculating it's going to be 50%. So the number of kept colonies is roughly half of what it was at the end of the Second World War. It's just a much more difficult thing to do now. Yes.
Has the impact shown up on crop yield?
And these quote industrialized beekeepers do a lot of colony splits, and I don't know if they're able to keep up with it because we're producing so much more than we were after the Second World War. I mean, it's 5 times or 6 times what it was then. And so they're needing even that many more bees to make it happen. But frankly, it can't go on forever. It just can't. Yes.
Actually, the reason I'm here is because I'm a gardener.
Mhm.
I've been a gardener for more than 60 years. The last 3 or 4, it's the first time in New England that I know of where we always raise bees for honey, not for pollination. I can't find honeybees. There are no wild ones left. Usually you could raise a garden, you don't have to worry about honeybees. Because the crops would attract however many they needed. I've got full peach trees in blossom. I go out there and not find a single honeybee. I can do the whole yard for an hour and maybe count 2 or 3. So all the wild colonies are dead.
That's right.
Obviously, they're
Yeah.
gone.
Yeah.
And it's a full wipeout. This is not, I've got beautiful fruit trees, full blossom. I got little ground bees, I got bumblebees, the related
It's
semi-pollinators.
Are the bubbles pollinated?
bumblebees. Yeah, they do.
Yeah.
Bumblebees are important for tomatoes, for example. They have to actually vibrate the flower in order to make the pollen drop.
A lot of pollen connectors too, I don't know if they all.
Yeah, no, what you are witnessing.
Systematic, all the fruit trees have been bred to be pollinated by honeybees.
Yes.
Because they're the systematic pollinators. They hit every blossom.
Yes. Yep.
I don't have to fit a peach tree anymore, I'm lucky. 40 peaches.
It's tragic. And as you know, I mean, people keep saying it's roughly 30 to 40% of the food that we eat is dependent on pollinators,
And this is,
and we're losing them. We are losing them.
we're not a desert in terms of crops either. This is the largest single regrowing forest on the planet. We have pollen and nectar right through.
So what you have to do is talk all your neighbors into keeping bees, keep bees yourself. It's the only way we're going to have bees until we can figure out, really what we have to do is figure out how to get all of the chemicals and pesticides and neonicotinoids and what have you out of the air. The air we breathe is so laden with this stuff. I got something today in the mail, and I had to laugh.
We used to throw DDT around in clouds.
Yes, yes.
Did not bother.
This came in the mail to me. All right, Scott's. One of the big bee killers is Roundup. How about 7? How about malathion? They're deadly to bees. I went online to see if they have a step 1 for killing certain kinds of plants that grow in your grass to get rid of it. But even if it isn't toxic to bees today, that combined with the other things that we put out in the same area can become doubly or triply lethal. We don't even know the effect of it. When they're studying bees anywhere on this continent, they find a minimum of 9 different kinds of toxic chemicals that they're carrying with them in low dosage. So we wonder why they don't survive they don't make it through the winters. I mean, I used to be able to sell honey year-round. My sign, if those of you who go up and down Bay Road have noticed, it's down, and it won't be up until probably early August.
Are the native bees being hit with pollen
It's hit, yes, it has,
Answer that?
yes, go ahead.
Um, Native bees are solitary bees. They're not colonies. The only difference is the bumblebee is the only colony-forming native bee. Okay? So in that sense, anything that hits the honeybees, because they're colonizers, would affect the bumblebee, because the bumblebee is the only social native bee. The rest are solitary.
I guess I wasn't concerned about native, I meant the honeybees that are around but are not in hives.
Wild honeybees.
Wild honeybees, are they getting hit?
I don't know anything about wild honeybees.
That's what I was just saying, is we never raise bees unless you wanted honey. If you were a gardener, you wouldn't care, because there were so many honeybees.
There were, yes.
So the tree that was cut down, that had a nest in it,
Yes.
was probably, it was probably European,
Oh, yes.
imported, and
Yeah.
actually chose that tree. No wild, there are no native.
No, you know where those bees probably came from? They're probably my bees that chose to swarm. They usually go about a mile or so from where they first issue. And, pardon?
They're quite close.
And I was the beekeeper at Appleton Farm for years. I gave up finally. You know why? It's too windy. There's just too much wind there. I don't know who's keeping them for them now, but Appleton was pretty cavalier about whether they had bees or not. I think they figured they were going to have enough pollinators, but I don't know if over time they're going to find that there may be certain plants that just don't produce because there aren't enough. But there is a beekeeper there now. Yes.
So I'm thinking of putting our hive on a small organic farm that's near where I live. Is that a good place for them? It's an organic vegetable farm?
Well, certainly if you,
Have a lot of fruit.
yeah, the question is, should I put my bees on an organic farm? Clearly, that's the preferable environment to put them in. But keep in mind, your bees are going to fly up to 5 miles. You may have a wonderful crop of X, but Y, 2 miles down the road, they much prefer.
Some areas your honey's going to have season, no matter where you're.
Yes, well, you know, for me, the big crop was loosestrife. I had loosestrife.
There's a band over that, too, the non-bees.
Yes, and the reason I knew it was loosestrife is when I harvest it and spin it out and I'm pouring it into the bottles, guess what it looks like? It's about the color of the combination of Dave's shirt and his vest. It looks like crankcase oil. It's kind of greenish blue, and it's really bitter. I can't eat it, but I have customers who love it, and they want me to save, the bottles of loosestrife honey. So, as you know, all honey is going to have its own flavor. People ask me, why is this honey so light and this honey so dark? And, what makes the loosestrife look kind of greenish blue? Well, it's the source of the flower, and the taste is going to be different. That's the fun thing about native raw honey. Another.
What I need to be careful of, referring to your story about Appleton, is keeping the hive not so fully exposed to the wind.
Yes, there are all kinds of advice that one will give you about where to put your bees, and the most important thing is to get it where it will get the first sun. It's facing south usually. It's not subject to winds. I built wind breaks, and it still didn't seem to help.
I did a northwest corner that will have leaves in the summer to shade it a little bit, but not in the winter till it gets. That's way on the other side of the hills when I get there.
So, yes, considerations about where you put your hives, it's very important. I mean, these are the things you're going to want to think about when you're placing your bee colonies. Yes, yes. And water source is important too. If the only source is your neighbor's swimming pool, do something about it.
Not too close. I had one that ended up, a stream ended up here. Wet, and they got so.
Well, you do not want to put your hive near a moist place. That's the last place you want. I started out by having them down near a pond I have, and I quickly learned that they don't do well in that situation. Again, they've got to keep the hive at 50 degrees. This is interesting. At 50 degrees humidity, what's the average humidity for us at any day of the year when you're walking around outside? Do you know? No? 70. It's somewhere between 70 and 75. I have what do you call it? A humidistat in my honey house, and it's important to me to see how much moisture there is in the air. And it's almost always at 70 or 75. When it's raining, of course, it's 90 something. And I haven't checked it in the winter because I'm not out there working in the winter. Yes, but it's very. A word about honey and water. If any of you have honey, whether it's raw or whether you buy it, I don't know about in the grocery store. You know that what you buy in the grocery store, in fact, isn't really honey. It's been heated to the point where all the natural enzymes have been killed. So I don't mean to diss Subi or whoever it is that sells that stuff, but it has none of the beneficial nutrients in it that you're going to want from regular honey, from raw honey. Raw honey, however, if it's left exposed to the air, honey is hygroscopic, and it will draw the moisture. We know now, 70% humidity, it will draw the moisture out of the air, right? Even though when the bees sealed it, it was only 16.5% water. It will raise the level of the water in it, and it will ferment. So don't leave your honey open unless you're going to eat it in the next few weeks, all right? Because it will ferment, and it's no fun when that happens because it's not good for anyone. Yes.
Do you call that pasteurizing when they cook it that hot?
I just call it a disaster.
So I know if I buy yours on the counter, it has not been heated.
That's right.
Do they have to tell you in the store whether that's been
No, they don't have to tell you. They don't have to tell you.
They don't even tell you whether they mixed it corn syrup.
That's right. As a matter of fact, where the question is whether it has corn syrup in it, the USDA occasionally tests the honey that's on the market, and we're finding that China is trying to get its honey into the United States through other countries. But we know it's Chinese because of the pollen. We can trace it back to its source, yes, which is really astounding. But there's no question that honey that is raw, the reason they're heating the honey to such a high temperature is they want to make it so the honey won't sugar up. You've probably seen raw honey that has crystallized, yes. And if you want to uncrystallize it, if you want to liquefy it again, just heat a pan with water on your stove, take it off the stove, and then place your jar in it, and it will re-liquefy just the way it was. But you know that in another few months it will recrystallize again.
Were they also trying to prevent us from getting ill or something? That's what I don't feed.
Oh, yes, that is the judge is out on that. Well, the question has been, is honey for, sometimes you'll see a sign that says, do not feed this to an infant under 1 year of age. We don't know if that's true or not. There may have been I will not say that that's necessarily true, and I certainly don't put that on my bottles.
I thought that's why they were cooking it.
No.
Honey is antibiotic.
Honey has,
Saturated solution, and bacteria have to have free water in order to.
that's right. As a matter of fact, I will tell you a little story about honey's. The honey has penicillin in it, and when I have a cut, I use honey on my cut. I had a chicken that had bumblefoot. If you've ever had a chicken, it gets something in its foot and it got infected. And I opened it up and cleaned it out. And I read somewhere, don't use something like Bactine or antibiotic on it that we use on humans. So I just grabbed a spoon from one of my jars of honey, and I slathered it over that foot, and I wrapped it up. And I had to bring it in twice after that, and I slathered it again. And guess what? It healed. It healed beautifully. Not only that, but my dermatologist is now telling me, guess what? They're now I told him, hey, honey's really, I'm going to use this on, it was some cut, and I told him I was being smarty and telling him I'm going to go home and he said, they're using it now, and they sell it for an outrageous price, and it is a wonderful disinfectant.
So do you think I can use that on my dog who has a fraction? What happened is he soothes himself, the fraction, we can't do anything about it anymore, he's 10, big. And what happens is after he exacerbates, he'll soothe himself by licking, then over-licking, and then he gets this abscess. So I have to use these awful, chemical ointments.
Well,
so I can
yeah.
probably put honey.
You certainly can. Yes, you certainly can. But just be sure to wrap. The question is whether she should put it on her dog who has an injury, but be sure you wrap it so that the dog can't lick it off, because you want to have it there. It is. Yes. Do we have a question?
You had started to talk about Chinese honey coming into this country through other nations. What's wrong with Chinese honey?
They water it down. It's one of the reasons they inspect it is they realize that it isn't 16.5% water. It's a much higher percentage of liquid.
So we have laws saying it must be.
Well, I know that there are certain laws about importing certain products, and I don't know the details of it. I just know that the beekeeping industry is outraged when the Chinese undersell our honey on our market because they have expanded the product by adding water to it. Why not?
This might be a good time
Yes.
to stop, and then we can.
Yes. Let
We
me
can
just finish
continue.
by saying I think one of the most stunning films I have ever seen was from China of a family in a valley that sold what were prized, it was either peaches or pears. It was a fruit that was so special, and it's so badly polluted that maybe some of you have seen this, that the bees have all died, and no one can even keep honeybees there, and so they're trying to pollinate by hand. And of course, they're down to a fraction of what they used to produce. As you were saying, you just don't have the productivity. Pardon? You do your own pollination. Yes, it's tragic. I should bring a hive over and just stick it under your.
I learned to buzz when I do it.
Well, I mean here.
That's a good point.
We have, yes, so we have a participant here who says he actually does his own hand pollination. You know what we might do? You could call me and let me know when the trees are in bloom, and I could bring a colony over and park it under your tree. Yes, so we could go on all night, but thank you for your questions and your interest.
On behalf of the Ipswich Conservation Commission, I want to thank Gradle Clark for coming tonight and giving us a presentation on the honeybee as pollinator. And she'll be around for a couple minutes after, so if you'd like to ask her a few more questions, please do. Thank you for all showing up again tonight. Thank you.